The Chicago penthouse was eerily quiet for a Friday evening. A deep silence had settled over the space, broken only by the whisper of the climate control system, a sound so constant it felt like the building's own breath. I rested a hand on the taut drum of my stomach, feeling our daughter shift inside me, and stared out at the sprawling city lights that glittered like a cold, distant galaxy below. At 36 weeks pregnant, my feet had swollen into abstract shapes I barely recognized. Tonight was meant to be Julian's coronation, the grand unveiling of the apex, his career-defining skyscraper. "This changes the skyline forever," he'd declared that morning, fastening a platinum watch around his wrist, his reflection in the polished marble wall, seeming more like a celebrated stranger than the man I loved. Julian's last text, heading into the gala, pinged on my phone 2 hours ago. I'd replied with a quick, "break a leg," but got nothing back. He's being swarmed, I reasoned. Architects, city officials, the press, the air in our home, thick with the scent of lilies he'd sent, felt heavy with my own formless anxiety. The unveiling was being broadcast live on the evening news, a flimsy electronic thread connecting me to the life he was living without me. I finally turned on the 100-inch television, the act feeling more like a duty than a desire. The segment began with the anchor gushing about the architecture. "And now we go live to the man of the hour, Julian," she announced. I saw him on screen, a colossus under the glare of the news cameras. Impeccable tuxedo, an aura of absolute control. The quiet confidence of a man who builds empires out of steel and glass. A familiar swell of pride rose in my chest before a cold detail snagged my attention. Julian was being interviewed alone, but the camera kept drifting to the crowd behind him. Maybe I was just hormonal. Maybe the long nights he spent at the studio were really about work. Maybe my anxieties were just a symptom of being isolated in this glass tower. Then my eyes found the VIP section, and I found her. She wasn't beside him, but she was in the orbit he had created, standing near the velvet rope, waiting. She was positioned to be his shadow, his inevitable next step. She smiled at something Julian said to the reporter, her head tilting toward him with an expression of private admiration. From the red carpet, he glanced her way and offered a small, knowing smile in return. It was the easy, unguarded expression I hadn't received in months. My breath hitched in my throat, a sudden sharp ache, as if the very air had become thin and brittle. Around her, Chicago's elite mingled and drank champagne, utterly unaware that my world had just fractured across a high-definition screen. The baby kicked, a sharp jab just below my heart. "Settle down, sweet girl," I whispered, my voice trembling with a confusion I couldn't name. "Is that the new lead designer from the London office?" For a moment, I held my breath. I sat perfectly still, my hand pressed against my belly, my body a frozen statue as my mind raced, desperately trying to build a plausible story to protect myself from the obvious truth. Julian was there, a king on his throne. He wasn't just standing near someone, and for a brief, idiotic second, I let a sliver of hope in. Perhaps she was his appointed liaison for the press. Perhaps it was just a professional courtesy he'd forgotten to tell me about. Perhaps in his speech, he would thank his wonderful wife, Amelia, watching from their home, pulling me into his victory from afar. I clung to that fragile idea like a castaway gripping a piece of driftwood, knowing it was too small to hold me, but terrified of the deep, cold water beneath. Then the reporter asked a final question. "Julian, you've thanked your firm, but we all know a vision like this needs a muse. Who is your true inspiration?" He smiled, a smooth, practiced gesture for the cameras. "You're right," he said, his eyes scanning the crowd and finding her instantly. "Chloe Vance, my senior design partner," he announced. "She was the soul of this project." The camera panned to her, and she gave a demure little nod. But it wasn't his words. It was the current that passed between them, a silent, powerful acknowledgement of a shared intimacy that had nothing to do with blueprints. My insides twisted. This wasn't a mentor praising a protege. It was a man presenting his real partner. The baby turned, a slow, heavy roll. "Oh," I gasped into the silent apartment. "Why is he looking at her that way?" I tried to swallow the knot forming in my throat, but it was solid, immovable. My mouth went dry, and I was suddenly afraid to inhale too deeply, convinced my lungs would turn to dust. I saw the glint of metal on her dress as she adjusted her lapel. A polished silver brooch, I knew all too well. Her hand brushed against it, a casual gesture that drew the camera's eye right to the piece of jewelry. And then it hit me, not as a fear, but as a fact, as cold and hard as the steel in his new building. He hadn't wanted me at the gala to protect my health. He hadn't wanted me there because my role was already filled. The magnificent penthouse felt like a cage, its breathtaking views a bitter mockery. Every congratulatory text that buzzed on my phone felt like another stone being thrown. Every burst of applause from the television speakers grated on my raw nerves. I should have switched it off. I should have protected myself from what came next. But my hand wouldn't move, held in place by a morbid need to witness the full extent of Julian's betrayal. And then the news camera zoomed in for a final shot. His eyes met the lens, and for a chilling instant, it felt like he was staring directly at me. There was no hint of guilt, no flicker of regret, only triumph. The woman, Chloe, moved to stand beside him, her face glowing with their shared success. Her gaze darted from him to the camera, absorbing, celebrating, and laying claim to the moment. He adjusted his bow tie, the very picture of a man who had conquered a city and was certain he would face no consequences. I saw her with blinding clarity only after Julian smiled at the camera. Until that second, she was just an elegant shape in a dark dress, a threat my mind had refused to process. But once his gaze found hers, and his public smile softened into something personal, my focus locked onto her with a cold, terrifying precision. She was younger than me, not by a decade, but by enough years to matter under the brutal clarity of television lighting. She held herself with a sleek, sharp ambition, the kind of deep-seated confidence that comes from a life of getting exactly what she wants. Her gown was understated and ferociously expensive, her makeup a flawless shield, her hair swept back with calculated severity. She moved to his side at the podium and accepted his hand on the small of her back. Her eyes met the camera as if she could see right through it to every person watching at home. There was no deference in her stance, no sign of being a mere employee. There was just a brief, radiant smile, a flash of mutual understanding, and then something else. A quiet assertion of her place, not just by his side, but at the center of his victory, as if she were the one who had laid the foundation. She didn't shrink from the spotlight. She didn't look like an architect on his team. Instead, she angled her body into his, her hip brushing against him. It was almost imperceptible, but it was a clear signal, a silent announcement. Julian started speaking again, answering a final shouted question, gesturing toward Chloe as he lauded her indispensable contributions. She listened with her head tilted, her gaze fixed on him, her lips curved into a perfect image of admiration. It was a masterful performance of partnership. A powerful kick from our daughter finally shattered my paralysis. "Oh, my baby," I whispered, my voice breaking. "Who is that woman?" The question hung in the vast, empty penthouse. I doubled over, wrapping my arms around my belly, as if I could shield her from this. My heart was a frantic drum against my ribs. I searched for words that wouldn't terrify the child I was carrying, for a lie that felt less like acid than the truth. She's just someone who works with Daddy, I murmured. Chloe watched Julian with a laser focus, a portrait of devotion. She was basking in his triumph, reading the room's reaction to them, as a couple, and deciding, I knew, whether she was dealing with a wife who would cause a scandal or one who would quietly disappear. I would not give her a scene. I pushed myself to my feet, forcing my back to straighten, forcing my lungs to take in steady air. I met her eyes on the screen, a total stranger who had just demolished my life. I saw it clearly then. She believed she had earned all of this, not just the man, but the entire kingdom that came with him, the acclaim, the influence, the title of his most essential partner. She had no idea she was just another asset in a portfolio that would one day demand a cost she could never anticipate. And neither of us knew that this public humiliation was only the first move. Julian walked through the door 3 hours later, glowing with success and champagne. He didn't look for me. He didn't call my name. He didn't seem to register my presence at all. He dropped his keys into a glass bowl on the console, his confidence only wavering when he finally saw me sitting there in the dark. His posture stiffened, his face shifting into the smooth diplomatic mask he used for difficult clients, the one engineered to diffuse any potential conflict. "Amelia," he said, his voice quiet, measured, "you're still awake. I was just about to text you." The unveiling was a massive success. Not, "I'm so sorry." Not, "We need to talk." Not even, "It's not what it looked like." Just a status report. It was then that I truly understood. He wasn't devastated that he had broken my heart. He was irritated that he now had to manage the consequences. My phone had been vibrating for the past hour, with texts from friends offering hollow congratulations, laced with pity. The casual, business-as-usual way he walked in felt profoundly obscene. Julian glanced at the huge, dark television on the wall, his jaw clenching as he connected the dots. "I'm running on fumes, Clara," he said, his voice clipped and sharp. "Let's not get into this right now." Get into this. Like my heartbreak was a tedious agenda item he could table for a later date. The baby kicked, a little flutter seeking reassurance. I pressed my palm to my belly, the tiny life inside a grounding force against the storm of Julian's deceit. "You failed to mention your lead architect was coming as your guest," I said, my tone eerily steady. The sound of my own composure was jarring. Julian sucked in a breath, a flare of raw irritation crossing his eyes before he smoothed it over. "It's more complicated than that, Clara." That was his mistake. Complicated was the word men like him used when the truth was simple and dirty. He glanced toward the ballroom entrance. Amelia, as I was now certain she was called, had vanished, but her presence was a cold void between us. "We can discuss this back at the penthouse. I don't want you getting worked up in your state." A cold dread washed over me, chilling me to the bone. He was already using our unborn son as a defense, twisting my righteous anger into a hormonal episode he needed to contain. "I believe I can handle hearing whatever this is," I replied. For the first time all evening, Julian's eyes fell to the swell of my stomach. "Clara," he said, his attempt at a gentle tone as hollow as a showroom, "please don't be dramatic." I didn't say a word. I just held his gaze, with an expression I didn't recognize as my own. It was unnervingly quiet, sharp, and utterly broken. Amelia had looked so polished in the event photos, the model of architectural brilliance. The image on that tablet wasn't an accident, it was a press release for their relationship. Julian squared his shoulders, his voice firming. "We will talk about this when you're thinking clearly. We'll talk about this in private," he commanded, the words a final verdict from a judge, a problem he had already solved. And in that instant, I saw the man Julian truly was when his perfectly designed world hit a snag. A man who wielded calm like a weapon, A man who mistook a lack of shouting for surrender. A man completely oblivious to the scale of the demolition he was about to bring upon himself. Julian's forced smile hung in the air, as fragile as a pane of glass. He waited, searching Sophie's face, likely expecting a hug or a quiet whimper, anything to maintain the illusion that he was still in control. Sophie offered him nothing. She simply stared up at her father with those lucid, serious eyes that had already learned to see through his easy charm. I felt her small hand slip from mine as she took a tiny step forward, no longer needing me as a shield. "Daddy," she said, her voice soft but solid. Julian's posture eased by a fraction, a flicker of relief on his face. "Yes, sweet pea." Sophie paused. I could practically see her lining up the facts in her little mind, carefully and deliberately. This wasn't a tantrum. These weren't tears. This was a child trying to piece together a puzzle her parents had just shattered. "Is she the reason you missed my science fair?" she asked, nodding toward Amelia. "Because you were working on the building designs with her?" The question was devastating in its simplicity. It held no malice, no accusation, only a child's honest attempt to connect the dots. The impact was instantaneous. Every bit of color drained from Julian's face. His jaw went slack before he snapped it shut. Whatever excuse he had ready for me, whatever story he planned to spin, it completely vaporized under the weight of that one innocent question. Next to him, Amelia went rigid. For the first time, her perfect, professional facade showed a crack. Her gaze darted to Julian, waiting for him to manage the situation, to fix it, to protect the flawless image she had just become a part of. He was silent. The murmur of the gala faded. Guests slowed down, pretending to check their phones while their attention was fixed on us. The entire terrace seemed to be holding its breath. "That's not—" Julian began, but his voice cracked. He swallowed hard, the sound loud in the sudden quiet. "It's much more complex than that." Sophie's forehead wrinkled. It didn't look complex. A knot tightened in my gut. I resisted the urge to pull my daughter back, to shield her from the heavy silence that followed, from the truth her father was too cowardly to speak aloud. But a deeper instinct told me to stand still, to let this moment unfold exactly as it was meant to. Julian knelt, his motions stiff and clumsy. "Sophie, grown-up things are sometimes hard to figure out," he said, his voice strained. "Sometimes people make very big mistakes." Sophie tilted her head. "Then why do you look so guilty, Daddy?" And that was it. Julian froze, his hands suspended uselessly in front of him. He looked exactly like what he was, a man cornered not by an enraged wife, but by the piercing clarity of his own child. Tears stung my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. This wasn't about my pain. This was the moment his daughter finally saw the man behind the facade, and Julian knew it. As his eyes lifted to meet mine, a tide of pure shame finally washed over the fear in them. And for the first time all night, he understood that something essential had been shattered. No matter how he tried to reframe this later, no matter what narrative he constructed, the truth had already been spoken, and it hadn't come from me. Julian pushed himself up, his expression hardening as if bracing for a collapse. The shame Sophie had unearthed vanished in an instant, replaced by something colder, more familiar. I knew that look. I'd seen it in negotiations when he was cornered on the facts and switched to pure intimidation. "Right," he muttered, adjusting the lapels of his $2,000 suit. His voice lowered into the deep, authoritative tone he used for hostile acquisitions. "This is over. Over. Not, 'I am so sorry you had to see that.' Not, 'I can't believe I let this get out.' Just over." He scanned the terrace, acutely aware of the lingering eyes of investors and city officials. He leaned in, his voice a harsh whisper for my ears only. You are not going to make a scene, Clara. We will handle this later, like civilized people. My breath hitched. I saw exactly what he was doing. He wasn't speaking to his wife. He was assessing me as a business risk, a threat to his reputation that needed to be managed before I caused more damage. No one is making a scene, I answered, my own voice equally low. This is the scene, Julian. His jaw clenched. You're getting emotional, he hissed, his lips barely moving. And Sophie doesn't need to be exposed to this. The words were strategic, designed to wound. You're emotional. You're unstable. You are the danger here. A searing wave of disbelief and fury washed over me. For years, I had shrunk my world to make his run seamlessly. I had let arguments go, delayed difficult conversations, and told myself my unwavering support was a form of strength. And now, at the gala, celebrating his greatest achievement, with our daughter standing between us and our second child on the way, he was attempting to frame me as the one who was unhinged. Sophie instinctively pressed against my leg, her small body sensing the shift in the air. She wasn't watching her father anymore. She was watching me. Amelia shifted on her designer heels, her discomfort now palpable. This was not the smooth corporate merger she had planned for. This was messy, public, and brutally real. Julian, I said, my gaze locked on his. You don't get to control this narrative. His face became stone. I am trying to protect my family. It was the most profound lie he had ever told. He wasn't protecting Sophie. He certainly wasn't protecting me. He was protecting the pristine brand of Julian Vance, the visionary developer who believed that if he spoke with enough calm, quiet authority, reality itself would bend to his will. I understood then that this was never just about an affair. It was about his suffocating, absolute need for control. And for the first time, a strange calm descended upon me, and my hands were steady. If I allowed him to silence me now, he would use that silence to define me for the rest of our lives. Whatever came next, I would not let that happen. Not for my sake, and certainly not for our daughters. It was Amelia who recomposed herself first. While Julian and I were locked in our silent war, she subtly adjusted her posture, as if reminding herself of her role in this play. Her shoulders straightened, her chin lifted, and she smoothed a non-existent wrinkle from her couture gown. The gesture was small, almost elegant, but it broadcast a message with brutal clarity. She was staying. Her eyes found mine again, this time without flinching. There was no defiance, no shame, just a cool, detached curiosity. Like an engineer observing a blueprint that had encountered an unexpected structural flaw. Then she smiled. It was not a smile of triumph. It was minuscule, controlled, an expression so practiced it could almost be mistaken for commiseration. But beneath it lay a chilling certainty. She believed this moment and this man already belonged to her. Julian, she said, her voice a soft murmur as she finally placed a hand on his arm. Darling, we're going to keep the investors waiting. The touch was a gesture of possession, the darling a public stake of her claim. She said it as a gentle reminder, not a question. Julian flinched, but only for a heartbeat. His eyes flickered from Sophie to my face, and then down to Amelia's perfectly manicured hand on his bespoke suit. I watched him do the math in his head, weighing this chaotic, immediate disaster against the path of least resistance. He didn't flinch when she touched his arm. Instead, Julian's jaw tightened as he gave a curt nod. Give me a moment. Chloe stepped away, a smirk playing on her lips as she turned, radiating absolute confidence. She knew, with unwavering certainty, that he would come to her. It dawned on me right then that she felt no fear, not of me, not of this disastrous confrontation. In her mind, the final act of this drama was already written. In her narrative, Julian would manage me. He'd offer some soothing lies, promise to fix everything, and then he'd walk out the door with her. I was just a temporary obstacle to be dealt with. Hysterical, inconvenient, and soon to be a relic of his former life. She was the prize at the end of this messy scene, a tiny foot pressed against my ribs from the inside, a silent flutter. She has the look of a winner, a small voice in my head whispered. I fought to breathe. It's not confidence, I heard myself say, my tone eerily calm. It's victory. Julian froze, his hand on the handle of our front door, and looked back. A flicker of annoyance crossed his face before being replaced by a well-rehearsed mask of concern. Clara, honey, we can talk about this later. I promise. Just let me get through this zoning commission hearing. Please. It wasn't a plea, it was a directive. My gaze drifted past him to a photograph on the console table. The two of us in Tuscany, smiling like two people I no longer recognized. A deep and unnerving clarity settled over me in that instant. This was bigger than the affair. Chloe was so certain she was winning, because Julian hadn't even bothered to construct a convincing deception. He took my obedience for granted. He fully intended to walk out that door to his meeting, leaving me to sit quietly amidst the rubble of our marriage. What neither of them understood was that his sheer audacity wasn't a sign of power. It was a strategic error of catastrophic magnitude. It was a misjudgment that was about to dismantle the future they had so confidently planned. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't throw a single thing. My complete stillness seemed to unnerve Julian more than any shouting match could have. He was prepared for tears, for accusations he could easily dismiss as hormonal outbursts. He had a well-worn script for handling my feelings. He was completely blindsided by my silent calm. I met his eyes, not with fury, but with a cold composure that felt alien, even to me. Fine, I said. The word was a stone dropping into a silent pool, devoid of warmth and weighted with an unmistakable finality. Julian looked genuinely bewildered, as if I'd suddenly switched to a foreign tongue. You're just letting me go? He managed to ask. A tiny, hollow smile touched my lips. I understand completely. My whisper was louder than any scream. The quiet in our Chicago penthouse was absolute, thick with all the ugly truths that were now out in the open. My hand instinctively covered my belly in a protective gesture. I felt a soft, rolling kick from within, a private language only we shared. The new life growing inside me was infinitely more real than the man in front of me. I'm going to pack a bag, I announced, my voice steady. I need to get out of here for a bit. I could see the relief wash over him, his shoulders visibly relaxed. That he agreed so easily was a sharper wound than any insult he could have hurled. I turned and walked toward our bedroom, my feet sinking silently into the deep pile carpet. The gravity of what I was doing felt like a physical weight in the air. From the walk-in closet, I pulled down a small overnight bag. I packed my work computer, my passport, and without a single glance back at Julian, I walked out of the life we had constructed. The brushed steel door of the penthouse whispered shut, its silence more damning than a slam in the stark gallery-like hall. Julian. I wouldn't let myself look back. Every footstep on the heated concrete floor was a calculated break from our life, a life lived 86 stories above the winding Chicago River. The faint rumble of a passing L train was a call from the real world, a city I had to rejoin alone. My focus remained locked on the private elevator's brass doors. A glance over my shoulder would have revealed the twisted steel sculpture he'd designed himself, its interlocking rings once symbolizing our inseparable bond. It meant nothing anymore. The only thing that mattered was the soft, insistent kick from within me. This new, fragile life was counting on me to build a world from the wreckage of this one. As the elevator began its silent descent, a notification lit up my watch face. I refused to look at his name. Not now. Julian could wait. His carefully constructed web of excuses could wait. The apologies, the rationalizations for his betrayal, all of it was sealed behind that closed door. As the elevator descended silently through the steel and glass tower, a powerful realization took shape. This wasn't a retreat. It was the first strategic decision I'd made for myself in a 5-year marriage that had slowly become a gilded cage. And while I had no idea what I would do in the next 5 minutes, let alone the next 6 months of my pregnancy, I was sure of one thing. The rules of my life were no longer his to write. The hotel room was impersonal, smelling of cleaning chemicals, with a view of 1,000 other windows. The exhaustion I had been keeping at bay finally overwhelmed me. A deep, weary ache that settled into my bones. For what seemed like an eternity, I just lay on the starched, unfamiliar comforter, one hand resting on my stomach, trying to borrow strength from the little life inside. Only then did I pull out my phone, bracing myself for the barrage I knew was coming. 5 missed calls, 10 text messages, all from Julian. I dismissed them all without reading a single one. Instead, I opened the banking app for the operating account of the art gallery I managed, our joint investment. It was my baby, the project I poured my heart into. The screen loaded, the numbers spun, and then settled. A cold, sickening dread washed over me. The balance was 0. The entire account had been liquidated that very morning. The transaction history showed a wire transfer to a shell corporation with a Delaware address. My contribution, the inheritance my mother had left me, the money I had invested with so much pride, it was all gone. For a full minute, the world went quiet. My lungs seized, a tight, unbearable pressure in my chest. I kept hitting refresh, praying it was a glitch in the system. It wasn't. This was deliberate. This was a scorched earth maneuver. My hands were shaking as I tried to open our joint credit account app. Access denied. A sterile message appeared. Your user privileges have been rescinded by the primary card holder. Julian hadn't just cheated on me. He had financially annihilated me. My phone buzzed again, an email from his executive assistant. The subject line read, "Moving forward. Attached, please find the proposed separation agreement." Proposed. As if this were a negotiation. I stared at the cold corporate language until the letters swam together. Agreement, like our marriage was a business venture that had failed, as if he hadn't just committed financial assassination, leaving his pregnant wife completely adrift. I glanced around the impersonal hotel room, at the generic print on the wall, and my single, small bag. For the first time since it all began, a raw, visceral fear cut through the numbness. I had no access to our funds, no relatives in this part of the country, and the one person I would normally call was the very man who had just waged all-out war on me. I sat on the edge of the mattress, a cold tremor running through me, replaying how I'd found out. His second phone, the one he thought I didn't know about, left carelessly on the charger. A notification from a luxury resort app had lit up the screen. Your Lake Geneva weekend for 2 is confirmed. He hadn't even used an alias. Now, his brutal efficiency made a terrifying kind of sense. He never imagined I would see that confirmation before he left for his hearing. I curled up on my side, wrapping the thin blanket around my shoulders, and watched the city lights blur. And in the empty space where shock had been, something else began to harden. It was icy, pointed, and new. It was determination. Because if Julian thought liquidating our assets would leave me powerless, he'd overlooked the one thing he could never, ever touch. The person I was forced to become now that I had nothing left to lose. The sun rose over Lake Michigan, sending sharp fingers of light into the room. It seemed too cheerful, too ordinary for the nightmare I was living. The baby shifted inside me, a gentle reminder that I wasn't just fighting for myself. I forced myself to get out of bed, take a shower, and call for room service, each movement precise and controlled. I sat down at the small desk and powered on my laptop, my hands steady. Julian had sent an email himself this time. The subject line was a single, cold word: arrangements. My pulse throbbed in my throat as I clicked it open. He wrote about the need for mediation, for prenatal calm, and the importance of a stable environment for our child. He referenced his demanding career as a developer and my current lack of liquid assets. Then I read the line that felt like a punch to the gut. To ensure total clarity during this emotional time, I think it's best we communicate only in writing. He was building a paper trail of my supposed instability. He was already laying the groundwork for a custody battle. I scrolled further, my jaw clenched so tight it ached. He offered a generous stipend to cover my expenses until the birth. He recommended I find a more practical living arrangement. Every single calculated jab was cloaked in the language of reasonable concern. There was no mention of Chloe, no mention of the fortune he had just stolen from me. This wasn't a separation. It was a hostile takeover. I shut the laptop and stared at my own reflection in the black screen. My face was pale, and my eyes were dark with exhaustion, but there was a new, flinty spark in them. For years, I had mistaken Julian's ruthlessness for drive, his guardedness for a desire for privacy. I had been an absolute fool. A sharp knock on the hotel room door made me flinch. A quick look through the peephole revealed a housekeeping cart. I shook my head and slid the deadbolt into place, the metallic clack echoing in the silent room. A crushing wave of loneliness hit me. I needed someone on my side. My fingers felt clumsy as I dialed my sister, Eleanor, in London. "Clara? It's 3 a.m. here. What's wrong?" And then I told her. The whole sordid story came pouring out of me in a frantic, tear-choked confession. Sloane let me speak until I was completely empty. The only sound left the dead air humming between Chicago and New York. When she finally broke the silence, her voice was clipped, surgical. This was his specialty, she said. Julian was the architect of every story. But, Alara, be honest with me. When was the last time you made a choice for yourself without first running it through the filter of how he would react? The question landed with the force of a physical impact. Julian thought his fortune, his army of lawyers, and his sneak attack gave him an unbreakable advantage. He was certain that soulless emails and corporate jargon could disguise his betrayal as a simple business decision. What he never grasped was that by reducing our life together to a negotiation, he had stripped all the emotion out of it, leaving me with the ice-cold clarity I so desperately needed. I was done trying to find a conscience in a man who had none. If he wanted to wage this war through paperwork, then I would become a strategist. I would arm myself with facts, and I would stop performing the role of the docile, supportive wife. My sister's lack of platitudes was more alarming than any outburst would have been. As an M&A specialist, she lived in a world of ruthless pragmatism. Her quiet was the sound of 1,000 tactical options being evaluated and dismissed. I wore a path in the cheap carpet of the hotel room, the phone scalding my ear as I awaited her judgment on the wreckage of my world. She was analyzing weaknesses, pinpointing leverage, and mapping out the first moves of a corporate takeover. When she finally spoke, her tone was low and dangerous. "Alara, he's not just preparing to leave you. He's laying the groundwork to paint you as an unstable parent." My own voice came out as a ragged whisper, Sloan, what do I do? Sloan's tone was all business. When you got engaged, did his family lawyers have you sign a prenup? The question felt like a bucket of ice water. I did, I admitted. They were insistent. It felt like a standard procedure. A knot of dread tightened in my stomach. He had been planning this from the very beginning, before he even put his ring on my finger. My hand shook as I braced it against the wall. You did not do anything wrong, Ilara, Sloane said, her voice firm. You trusted the man you loved. That's not a character flaw. She paused, taking a breath. But you dodged my real point, she continued. He gave you a list of his expectations. He told you what was happening. In all that time, did he ever stop to ask you what you wanted? The profound silence that followed was the only answer she required. No one ever considers what you want, Ilara, Sloane said, her voice softening slightly. Her words fractured a dam inside me. I leaned against the cool plaster, stunned not by the revelation itself, but by the fact I had never consciously acknowledged, that gaping hole at the center of my marriage. I've watched it for years, Sloane pushed, her tone hardening again. Julian decides, Julian acquires, and you just make it work. But nobody is watching your back. A single, hot tear carved a path down my cheek. I instinctively cupped my free hand over my stomach, a futile gesture to hold my shattering life together. I'm okay, I lied, the words feeling like ash in my mouth. I have to be. I know, she answered, but I'm just so relieved you finally see him for what he is. She clutched the phone, her resolve traveling across the miles. I'm booking you a flight to New York. In that moment, an idea that was both terrifying and electrifying took hold. Julian had not just misjudged my resilience. He had forgotten about my sister entirely. For the fight that was coming, the depositions, the filings, the brutal back and forth, he had no earthly idea of the storm he had just unleashed. The most damning witness to his character was already assembling my legal team. I found Ms. Camilla Reyes through a referral. From Sloane, of course. The text message had been blunt. You're meeting her in Chicago. The appointment is booked. She's a shark. Her firm was on the top floor of a minimalist skyscraper, the kind of place where family legacies were clinically dissected with surgical precision. I sat in the sterile waiting area, clutching a cup of tea I couldn't drink, feeling like an imposter in a world of wealth and power. Ilara? A crisp voice called. I looked up. The woman was in her early 40s, radiating a level of authority that required no effort. Her eyes were sharp and intelligent, assessing me not with pity, but with a quiet, analytical intensity. Please, sit, I said, motioning to the chair across from me. Thank you. She gave a curt, professional nod and took her seat, placing a sleek tablet on the table between us. We made some forgettable small talk about the relentless Chicago wind and the city's architecture. The conversation was perfectly bland until her gaze landed on my phone screen, where I'd been staring at the digital mock-up for a custom jewelry design, and her polite facade instantly dissolved. Julian Croft, she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper. A paralyzing chill shot through me. How could you possibly know his name? She held my gaze for a long moment before letting out a slow, weary breath. This is exactly what I was afraid of. An icy dread began to snake through my veins. Afraid of what? She didn't reply right away. Instead, she extended a hand. I'm Camilla Reyes. I'm a litigator specializing in high-conflict divorce. That explained the confidence. I demanded to know more. Camilla leaned back, her eyes never leaving mine. 5 years ago, I represented his first wife during their divorce, she said, each word landing like a chip of ice in the silent room. The sound in my ears faded to a dull roar. I know his tactics, she went on. The extravagant gifts designed to create a sense of obligation. The sudden business opportunities that are actually financial traps. The patronizing calm he projects the moment he gets caught. My heart pounded against my ribs. Are you telling me he has done this before? She gave a single, sharp nod. The cast of characters changes, but the script is always the same. I recognized the pattern the instant you said his name. I braced myself for a new wave of despair or rage. What washed over me instead was something totally unexpected: validation. Not because the pain was any less, but because, for the first time since that jewelry design popped up on our tablet, I knew I wasn't losing my mind. Camilla slid her business card across the glass table. I'm not here to persuade you, she said directly, but our meeting feels like more than a coincidence, and I know for a fact that you do not deserve what he is planning. My gaze shifted from the elegant, minimalist card to her face. What do I do? Her expression was solid steel. I recommend you stop absorbing the hit and start building your defense. As my fingers closed around that piece of heavy cardstock, a profound clarity settled over me. Julian had a plan for my sadness. He had a strategy for my anger. What he had no strategy for was me, sitting in the office of the one person in the world who had already seen his entire playbook from beginning to end. Camilla didn't push me. That was the first thing I noticed as the city traffic hummed far below our silent conference room. She allowed the quiet to linger, giving me room to process it, to feel the terror, and to choose whether I wanted a shoulder to cry on or a weapon. I'm not asking you to take my word for it, she said at last. I'm asking you to look at the data. I nodded slowly. She unlocked her tablet, pulled up a file, and angled the screen toward me. It wasn't a legal brief, but a kind of timeline, an operational flowchart of a past case with actions linked by arrows. It begins here, she said, tapping the screen. Unscheduled work trips with vague destinations, lavish gifts that function as emotional leverage. After that, he initiates the exit plan. My stomach clenched. He starts moving assets, she continued, not in large, obvious transactions. Small diversions, piece by piece, until the financial foundation you thought you had has eroded. Then his behavior shifts. He becomes overly solicitous, thoughtful, almost insultingly gentle. I thought of Julian's text from that morning. We'll figure this out together. My hands balled into fists in my lap. And the baby? I asked, my voice thin. Camilla's expression hardened. The baby is the final piece. He will position his concern as proof that he is the more grounded parent. He will use your pregnancy, your hormones, your supposed fragile state as evidence against you. He'll market himself as the only sane person in the room. It took all my strength to form the next question. Did it work the last time? She paused, her gaze turning inward for a moment. For a while, yes, she conceded, the words thick with history. My client's divorce was a war, she said. But I learned his strategy. I watched him systematically convince these brilliant, self-assured women to question their own sanity, while he projected this flawless image of composed rationality. By the time they knew what was happening, they were already on the defensive, simply reacting to his meticulously planned moves instead of making their own. A sharp, cold focus cut through my fear. He expects me to fall apart, I said, the words barely audible. Camilla gave a single nod. He's banking on it. I looked at the screen again, at the terrifyingly familiar pattern displayed in front of me. The diagram was both horrifying and strangely empowering. Chloe, I said suddenly. The architect. Does she have any idea? A small, grim smile touched Camilla's lips. She knows the story he's sold her, that you're having difficulties, that the marriage is complex. that he's trying to manage it all. The feeling that rose in my chest wasn't jealousy. It was a sudden, unwelcome wave of pity. She thinks she's the one, I said. They all think they're the one exception to the rule, Ms. Albright said, her voice calm. I leaned back in the leather chair, the last few weeks snapping into a brutal, clear picture. The blueprint I'd found, his recent trips to check on a new development, the sudden transfer of the lake house into my name, the placating texts. Julian wasn't panicking because I'd discovered his affair. He was executing the careful demolition of our marriage, a project he'd planned for months. The truly terrifying part wasn't that he thought he was smarter than me, it was his absolute conviction that I'd never see the master plan until I was standing in the rubble of my own life. I looked at Ms. Albright. So, what's the move when your opponent has already anticipated your entire defense? She slid the tablet across the polished mahogany desk. You don't play his game. You change the rules. For the first time since my world imploded, I felt something solid under my feet. It wasn't hope, it was a strategy. I didn't call Julian when I left her downtown office. That was the first move he never saw coming. Instead of bombarding him with frantic calls and accusations, I did something far more unnerving to a man who craved control. I went silent. I replied to his messages, but only after a delay of several hours. My answers were short, agreeable, and non-committal. The perfect performance of a confused, compliant wife he wanted to present in court. While he assumed I was breaking down, I was building my case. Ms. Albright connected me with a forensic accountant. I started diverting the income from my freelance architecture projects into a newly opened private account. We began to map every single LLC Julian had formed or dissolved in the past year, creating a perfect schematic of his financial maneuvers. I never said a word about it to him. I was just gathering my materials. At night, with the Chicago skyline glittering beyond my window, I'd sit with my laptop, drinking mint tea and studying Illinois property law, precedent-setting custody cases, and negotiation tactics. I was learning a new language, one where a reasonable message was proof of manipulation and strategic quiet was a position of power. Julian sent another text. Glad we can handle this, like adults. We need to be on the same page for the baby. I almost scoffed. He interpreted my calm as surrender. He saw my civility as a weakness. He mistook my silence for shock because that was the only role he'd ever written for me in his script. Miss Albright had urged me to be patient. Men like Julian get sloppy when they think the deal is already closed, she had advised. Give him enough rope to tangle himself. And so I did. I agreed to a preliminary meeting with a mediator. I never mentioned the penthouse blueprint. I never questioned his version of our finances. I let him drone on about market projections, 5-year plans, and creating a legacy for our unborn child, knowing every word was just another piece of evidence for my file. In the background, my lawyer, Ms. Albright, submitted the formal requests for financial disclosure, a quiet, procedural move he couldn't sidestep. When the documents arrived, his entire blueprint was exposed. Julian hadn't just shuffled money around. He had systematically hidden it. There was a network of newly created holding companies and prime properties sold for a fraction of their value, all built on the assumption that I wouldn't know which deed to examine until it was too late. Ms. Albright looked at me from across her desk. This is a fortress. I nodded. I know. What Julian never grasped was that my goal was never to burn his empire to the ground. I had no desire for a public spectacle or a dramatic battle. I was constructing a case so structurally sound that he would have no leverage, no escape clause, no way out. Every patronizing text he sent explaining zoning laws to me, an architect, became an exhibit. Every attempt to paint me as the emotional, irrational pregnant wife only solidified his own pattern of coercive control. And piece by piece, without ever raising my voice, I was quietly drafting a new ending to the story he had planned for me. By the time he understood, I was no longer reacting to his moves, but making my own. The terms of the deal had already been rewritten. This time, I wasn't just a feature in his development, I was the one holding the permits. Simone called me 3 days later. The number was blocked on my prepaid phone, and I nearly let it go to voicemail, but some instinct told me to answer. "Hello?" she asked, her voice strained with artificial cheerfulness. "It's Simone. I was the designer for Julian's Lakeshore project." Project. I closed my eyes for a second. "I know who you are." A heavy silence filled the line. I needed to call," she started, her voice wavering. "I think there's been a major breakdown in communication. Julian is under an immense amount of stress with the new zoning permits." I said nothing, letting her fill the void. The words came tumbling out, a rehearsed speech about difficult investors and complicated city politics, and how nobody wanted there to be any collateral damage. It was the kind of corporate damage control meant to neutralize a problem without admitting any wrongdoing. Then the professional mask began to crack. "He's not answering my messages," she said, her voice sharp with an edge of panic. He said we need to create some distance for now, to manage perceptions." And there it was, the part of the architectural plan she had never been shown. Julian hadn't chosen her over me. She was just a design element, a temporary feature intended to help him transition from one life to the next. Now that the transition was facing delays, he was scrapping non-essential components. "I understand," I said, my voice perfectly neutral. Simone let out a frustrated sigh. "It's not right. He promised me an equity partnership." I resisted the urge to laugh. Instead, I asked, very softly, "Did you ever get that in a signed contract?" The dead silence on her end of the line was all the answer I needed. She tried to recover. "He told me you were going through a difficult time, that this divorce might get messy, and he had to protect the project's image for the investors." All my anger had evaporated, replaced by a cold, hard certainty. "He tells everyone that," I said. "It's his standard procedure when he needs you to buy into his version of the facts." I could hear her sharp intake of breath. What does that mean?" she asked. I chose my next words with precision. "It means that if he really planned to build a future with you, he would be laying the foundation, not just showing you renderings." Another pause, this one longer. "And he's not," she whispered, the truth finally sinking in. "No," I confirmed. "He's not." We disconnected a few moments later. There were no harsh words, no final accusations, just the low hum of a woman realizing she was just a line item on an invoice. That night, Miss Albright forwarded me an email. Julian's attorneys had filed a motion for continuance, citing unforeseen instability in the commercial real estate market that was impacting his personal holdings. He was stalling. Simone had believed she was the flagship property, the penthouse suite, the grand unveiling. She never understood that for men like Julian, people aren't replaced with upgraded models. They are replaced with more convenient ones. When the deal got complicated, he did what he always did. He isolated the liability. Julian's world didn't collapse in one spectacular implosion. It began to decay, the way his schemes always did. In LLC, paperwork, and property deeds, he was certain no one would ever have the authority to scrutinize. But this time, his carefully constructed corporate veil didn't shield him. It suffocated him. Ms. Albright, my lawyer, called me on a Tuesday. "The forensic team found the payment chain for the penthouse furnishings," she said. her tone crisp and professional. "And they've tied the LLC that holds the lease directly to Simone." I stood in my new, smaller apartment, watching the boats on Lake Michigan, in a city that had already moved on from the developer, who once promised to redefine its skyline. "So what's next?" I asked. It means he breached his fiduciary duty to the marital estate," she explained. "Once that is officially in the court record, his entire professional credibility is gone." Julian missed a crucial planning commission meeting, then another. His primary investors gave him one extension, then pulled their funding on the second. Every missed deadline triggered a new penalty clause in his loans. Every penalty brought another one of his secrets into the open. At his deposition, he was arrogant and dismissive, his usual polished presentation cracking under a rage he couldn't conceal. The man who gave lectures on urban innovation couldn't explain the tangled mess of his own financial records. His answers grew evasive, his logic full of holes. That's when Ms. Albright intervened. "Mr. Vance," she said evenly, "this entire process is about establishing a clear chain of title." Title? The word hung in the air of the sterile conference room, an accusation he couldn't spin. Weeks later, the judge's ruling was issued. A full, court-ordered receivership of all his personal and business assets. Immediate repayment of all funds diverted to the shell companies. I was granted sole custody of our infant son, Leo, with Julian's visitation rights suspended until he completed a court-mandated psychological assessment. It wasn't the revenge I once craved, but the security the blueprints demanded. Julian tried to save his reputation, making desperate calls to his network, but the damage was done. The professional fallout was swift and total. The Chicago Architectural Guild announced his keynote speech was canceled due to unforeseen scheduling conflicts. His name was quietly removed from the list of judges for a prestigious design award. The young architects he had taken under his wing suddenly stopped returning his calls. I found no joy in his downfall. From my quiet corner of the city, I watched the architectural dynasty he'd built on minimalist perfection and critical acclaim begin to fracture under the weight of his own elaborate lies. Julian had always moved through the world as if rules were for ordinary, disorganized people who couldn't design their lives with precision. He never imagined the mess would end up on his own pristine doorstep. The last message he ever sent me lit up my phone late one night. I never anticipated this conclusion. I glanced at the words, then placed my phone face down. This was the only way it could have ever ended. He was just too insulated to realize it, because, until this moment, someone else had always been there to absorb the damage from his mistakes. As I tucked Leo into his bed that night, he shifted and gazed up at me. "Are we okay now, Mommy?" "Yes, my sweet boy," I promised, my voice unwavering. "We are." And for the first time since I'd stumbled upon those blueprints, I felt it was the undeniable truth. Julian had forfeited the one thing he prized more than any award, his unblemished public image. And for that kind of loss, there was no contingency plan. Our new apartment was a fraction of the square footage of the penthouse we'd abandoned. The windows overlooked a brick alley instead of the sweeping Chicago skyline, and the old floorboards groaned under my feet. But it was our sanctuary. It was bathed in afternoon sun, and it was a 5-minute walk from Leo's preschool. When we left, we took only what could be packed into my sedan, along with a profound serenity I hadn't known in years. It turned out that tranquility didn't require much closet space. Our days settled into a new, gentle cadence. Mornings were no longer a frantic race against an unforgiving corporate clock. I'd sip my tea while Leo, strapped in his high chair, would babble at pigeons and carefully smear jam into his eyebrows. I set up a small desk in our living room, the tap of my keyboard, a soft rhythm against the city's hum. No one was there to question my judgment. No one was there to police my tone. No one was there to gently suggest I was remembering things incorrectly. In the evenings, with Leo fast asleep, I would curl up with a book, the quiet drone of the refrigerator a comfort, never once bracing for the clinical beep of a keycard unlocking the front door. I didn't long for the cold, cavernous silence of that high-rise apartment. I didn't long for the relentless, simmering stress that we had mistaken for ambition. I didn't long for the way I had trained myself to rehearse every word before I dared to speak it. This new liberty was so much more peaceful than I had ever allowed myself to imagine. My lawyer, Catherine, would check in sometimes, not for business anymore, but as a confidant. "You sound grounded, Chloe," she remarked during one call. I hadn't known how badly I needed to hear it affirmed by someone else. Julian faded into a series of bureaucratic afterthoughts, his presence confined to scheduled emails and formal inquiries, filtered through our legal teams. He no longer issued demands disguised as requests. He no longer spun intricate webs of justification. His authority over my world had vanished, and with it, the ironclad confidence he once wore like a bespoke suit. It was Leo who first articulated the change in me. "Your smile lives in your eyes now," he declared one afternoon, as we constructed a wobbly fortress out of blocks. "Does it?" I asked, completely taken aback. He nodded with the profound gravity that only a 4-year-old can muster. "Yep, all the way." A genuine laugh bubbled up from my chest, and I was struck by how deeply he was right. I wasn't wealthier. I hadn't been rescued by a hero. I wasn't magically without fear, but I was self-sufficient. I signed my own lease. I made my own choices. I followed my own gut without seeking external validation. The life we were building wasn't designed for an audience's approval. It was authentic, and it was entirely ours. There are some nights, in the stillness after midnight, when my mind wanders back to that woman staring at a set of architectural drawings, feeling her foundation crack with every detail she absorbed. I wish I could reach through time to talk to her, not to tell her it would be simple, but to promise her that the ground beneath her feet would one day feel solid again. And that would make all the difference. I met Marcus on a bright autumn day, an encounter that was a product of pure chance. It was a community harvest festival at a local park, the air smelling of fallen leaves and grilled corn, filled with the sound of a folk band. Leo was spending the day with his grandparents, and I had gone out by myself, wanting to feel more connected to the neighborhood I was learning to call home. Marcus was at a stall for a local community garden, showing kids how to press apple cider. He was completely at ease, not looking for attention, but earning it with a quiet competence. His voice was warm and encouraging. He spoke about soil health as if it were a fascinating story, about how different plants support one another, about growing food that was meant to be shared with neighbors. I found myself lingering, listening for much longer than I'd intended. All around him, families were laughing and engaging. I was examining a ridiculously oversized pumpkin when he came over. "Hope you're enjoying the organized chaos," he said, a genuine smile in his eyes. "It's wonderful," I replied. "It feels real." He let out a soft chuckle. Real usually tastes better than perfect. We made small talk for a while about the neighborhood, the challenges of urban gardening, and other simple things. He never asked why a woman like me was at a family festival alone on a Saturday. He didn't mention any accolades his garden had won or try to impress me. He just seemed to listen attentively. When I mentioned Leo in passing, his expression shifted to one of easy understanding, not pity. "I have a daughter," he said. "She's with her mom this weekend." His tone was straightforward, a simple fact, with no complicated story attached. We traded phone numbers with a casualness that felt like a deep, cleansing breath. Over the following weeks, our connection grew in small, unforced steps. A text message with a photo of a strangely shaped carrot, a cup of coffee at a corner cafe before his workday began, a shared, comfortable silence on a park bench, watching the city lights flicker on. He never pried, never tried to excavate my history, never seemed to need anything more than what I chose to share. Then one evening, as we sat watching the fog drift over the lake, he said something that resonated deep within me. "I'm not looking to rebuild your past," he said, his eyes on the distant shoreline. "I'd just love to be part of a future you're excited to design." It was the absolute antithesis of everything I had known with Julian. He wasn't trying to renovate my personality. He wasn't competing with my memories. He wasn't promising an idyllic, flawless existence. And because of that, the defenses I had so painstakingly constructed began to feel unnecessary when I was with him. Marcus wasn't a reward for what I had survived. He was a gentle path that became visible only after I had learned to navigate my own terrain. And for the first time in a very long time, that felt like a stable foundation from which to imagine building something new with someone else. We were intentional. That was the quiet understanding between us from the very beginning. Life had already shown us both the folly of mistaking emotional intensity for genuine connection. So we moved with care, allowing trust to blossom in the calm spaces of our lives. Leo met Marcus several months later, not as a potential new father figure, but simply as my friend Marcus, who came over to help us plant a window box of herbs and ended up staying to discuss the merits of various dinosaurs. Marcus never forced it. He wasn't trying to be the fun new guy or offer unsolicited parenting tips. He was simply there. He was consistently kind, and he let Leo set the pace of their friendship. One night, while we were cleaning up after one of our simple dinners, Leo looked over at Marcus and said, "It smells like a happy home when you're here." A slow smile spread across my face because I knew exactly what he meant. Marcus just smiled back and quietly finished wiping the counter. The proposal came on an ordinary Thursday. We were in the community garden, the air smelling of damp earth and rosemary. Marcus turned to me and asked a question that was as honest and unpretentious as he was. "Chloe, would you want to build a life with me?" he asked. "On our own timeline." There was no diamond ring or elaborate production, just a deep sincerity in his eyes. My yes was immediate and sure. Our wedding was held in that very garden. A few dozen mismatched chairs, pots of lavender, nothing for show. Leo walked me down the gravel path, carrying our rings in a small wooden box that Marcus had made for him. As Leo handed us the rings, he whispered, "You look happy, Mom. Like, for real, happy this time." It wasn't a dazzling, victorious joy. It was the kind of happiness that takes root in your soul and builds a home there. Julian was not even a fleeting thought. He didn't need to be. He was a character from a book I had finished reading years ago. As Marcus and I spoke our vows, we didn't make grand promises of a life without struggle. We promised only to be gentle with each other, to be honest, and to show up for one another, especially when things got hard. Later, as the evening turned cool and the sound of our friends' laughter drifted through the garden, Leo came and wrapped his arms around both of us. "This feels right," he said. That was the only seal of approval that ever truly mattered. The life I had lost, the one defined by skyline views and society pages, had once seemed like my entire world. But standing there, my bare feet on the cool earth, surrounded by people who loved the person I had become, I finally understood the truth. My old life hadn't been destroyed. It had been cleared away, making space for something real to grow. And what flourished there in its place was not victory or vengeance, it was peace. I found myself at O'Hare International Airport again 2 years later. A different ticket, a different destination, but the same hopeful glint from the brightly polished floors. The gentle hiss of the gas stove catching fire had become the soundtrack to our evenings, a quiet rhythm for our new life. This time, Leo looked up from his drawing, a smudge of crayon on his cheek, his bangs falling over his forehead. Mark was chopping vegetables at the counter, and he caught my eye with a smile that was all comfort. It wasn't a question or a check-in, just a simple, warm tether between us. I paused, my hand hovering over a drawer. The memory struck me like a physical blow. I was in that same spot in a different, sterile kitchen where my entire world had fractured, where a carefully constructed illusion was shattered, and a sickening reality unfurled, not with a loud crash, but with the soft click of a mouse. I remembered the chill that spread through my limbs, my fingers digging into the cold marble island, the horrifying clarity in my ears as his lies were laid bare by his own voice. Mark noticed my hesitation and walked over. "Hey, you back with us?" he asked softly. I managed a weak nod. "Yeah, just a bad memory passing through." He knew exactly which one. He didn't have to ask. Leo glanced around our cozy, lived-in kitchen. That other house had speakers in the walls that played music everywhere, he observed, not with longing, but with the simple recall of a child. "It did," I replied, my voice steady. He considered this for a moment, before adding, "I'm glad our radio is in here with us." So was I. We sat down to eat, the chatter easy and light, the aroma of roasted chicken filling our space. Beyond the window, the lights of Boston glowed, a tapestry of a million individual stories, some grand, some small. It hit me then that the technology, the smart home, the seamless automation, none of it was the true cage. The prison was the performance, the relentless pressure to maintain a flawless facade, the terror of losing that curated image, and the deeper fear of admitting that the celebrated tech mogul I had married was a stranger. I had faced that fear head-on, not by hardening myself, but by allowing myself to be broken open, by choosing a gloriously imperfect, tangible life over a sterile, programmed one, by fleeing that glass-walled fortress when staying would have meant the complete erosion of my soul. Julian Croft was now just a name in the tech headlines, tied to some new smart device. He wasn't a figure of hate or forgiveness. He was just no longer the architect of my reality. That part of my life was over. The only thing that mattered was what I had built since. A home defined by laughter, not by programmed schedules, a relationship founded on honesty, not on image, a son who was discovering that love is about showing up for each other, not about putting on a show for the world. As we cleared the table, Mark wrapped an arm around my waist. Leo started doing a ridiculous robot dance by the sink, his face split by a wide grin. This was it. I saw the glowing numbers on the microwave's clock, a simple display, and then looked back at my family, a profound sense of peace washing over me. Some endings shatter you, but others set you free. That morning in the home office had done both, and standing here now in my own kitchen, I finally grasped the full shape of my journey. I didn't lose everything in that automated prison. I escaped it. As we conclude this story, let's pause for a moment. Because if you've followed this narrative to its end, it's probably because some part of this experience resonated with you on a personal level. This was never just a tale of infidelity and privilege. It serves as a potent reminder that our most formative moments are frequently the ones that tear us down, as they are what give us the chance to rebuild ourselves into something stronger and more true. A central lesson can be found in Stoic thought. The philosopher Seneca famously said, True happiness is to enjoy the present without anxious dependence upon the future. The pain Amelia suffered was immense, but her recovery truly began not when she tried to expose Julian, but when she decided to reclaim her own integrity, her own life, and her own future from a reality that was built on deception. Another Stoic principle is that the obstacle itself is the path forward. The smart home's audio archive, the pressure of the tech world, the betrayal. All of these became the raw materials for her healing, not just the cause of her suffering. This story illustrates that leaving a life that looks perfect from the outside is not a sign of failure, and embracing a simpler life is not a step backward. More often than not, the most courageous act is to trade a comfortable illusion for a demanding truth. So, if this narrative struck a chord with you, if it reflected a piece of your own experience, please know that you are not walking your path by yourself. Take a second to like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear this, and subscribe for more stories like this one. Your own experience and your presence in this community are incredibly valuable, and your own story is still unfolding. The preceding narrative is a work of fiction developed purely for the purpose of storytelling and emotional exploration. While it draws inspiration from real-world challenges and universal human themes like relationship dynamics, family struggles, and personal development, all characters, situations, and events portrayed are entirely fictional. Any resemblance to real individuals, living or deceased, particular places, or actual events is completely coincidental. The purpose of this content is not to present factual information, provide legal advice, or make real-world accusations. Instead, its ambition is to delve into emotional truths and life lessons using the framework of a story. Viewers are invited to engage with the narrative as a dramatized scenario meant to inspire thought, empathy, and personal reflection, rather than as a factual account of real people or occurrences. This content is not created to cause harm, spread misinformation, or engage in any form of defamation. It is presented for the sole purposes of entertainment, thoughtful discussion, and the building of an emotional connection with our audience.